Gustav Fechner was the founder of a new and objective approach to the measurement of mental events. He hoped that the kind of strict experiments that had beaten the forces of nature into the laws of physics could work for the mind of man as well. Yet despite the orderly, reductionist nature of his ideas, Fechner, in 1860, permitted himself an extraordinary speculation about personal consciousness. The brain is bilaterally symmetrical. It has two sides which are virtually mirror images of each other. Nowhere is this clearer than in the cerebral hemispheres. There's a deep cleft between the two halves, which are linked by an enormous strap containing millions of nerve fibres, the corpus callosum. If consciousness is a property of the brain, which Fechner certainly believed, what would happen if the cerebral hemispheres were literally split apart completely? As the psychologist William McDougall reported in 1911, Fechner asserted that if a man's brain could be mechanically divided into two parts without arresting the life of the parts, the nervous activities of each part would be accompanied by its own stream of consciousness. But McDougall was convinced that no mere split in the brain could divide the mind. This hypothetical, inconceivable experiment of Fechner and McDougall has actually been performed, and its results are, quite simply, some of the most fascinating produced during research on the brain. The rationale behind this unlikely story is that an epileptic seizure, originating at a focus of damage on one side of the brain, can spread to the other hemisphere through the nerve fibres of the corpus callosum. The attack then takes on the terrible proportions of a grand mal convulsion, involving the whole body. Now, in California, in the 1950s, experiments with animals had demonstrated that cutting the corpus callosum didn't interfere in a gross way with movement or any vital function. So a bold, some would say reckless surgeon decided to split the corpus callosum in a few patients who had intractable epilepsy, in the hope that it would moderate their fits. It did, to an unexpected extent. Not only did the convulsions no longer involve both sides of the body, but they were reduced in frequency too, though the reason for this therapeutic bonus is still unknown. But what of the other consequences of this unlikely invasion of the mind? Who was right, Fechner or McDougall? Roger Sperry and his collaborators at the California Institute of Technology, who had already done much of the preliminary work with animals, had the chance to examine these people whose brains had been split. At first, the patients seemed remarkably normal. Indeed, that had always been the conclusion in previous studies of people who had suffered damage to the corpus callosum. However, careful and often ingenious psychological testing revealed a bizarre mental syndrome. Sperry took advantage of the fact that the connections to and from one hemisphere are mainly concerned with the opposite side of the body. If a split-brain patient is blindfolded and some familiar object like a comb or a coin is put into one hand, he can use that same hand to retrieve the object from a collection of similar things by touch alone. But ask the other hand to do it, and the result is pure guesswork. Imagine the patient looking fixedly at a point, and a picture of an object is flashed momentarily just to the left of that point, so that it's seen only by the right hemisphere because of the distribution of nerve fibres from the eyes to the brain. Now the patient can select the object portrayed by sight or even by touch alone when he uses his left hand, but not his right, to choose from an array of objects. Each hemisphere, then, seems whole in itself, but with only half a body to serve it. In Sperry's own words, everything we have seen so far indicates that the surgery has left these people with two separate minds, that is, two separate spheres of consciousness. What is experienced in the right hemisphere seems to be entirely outside the realm of awareness of the left. Judged by any simple criterion, like seeing, feeling, remembering, or moving, there's not much to choose between the skills of the two hemispheres. To that extent, Fechner was correct. Indeed, Sperry's descriptions convey an eerie impression that the split-brain patient is no longer one person, but two. Both hands do indeed have minds of their own. But mind left and mind right aren't equal in every respect. The biggest difference between them, or at least the most obvious, is that one hemisphere, the left in all of Sperry's patients, does the talking. Put an object in the right hand, or flash a picture on the right of the visual field, and the patient, or rather his left hemisphere, can tell you what it is. But show it on the left side, so that only the right hemisphere knows about it, and the articulate left is lost for words. So the mind that makes its presence felt, because it can speak, is that of the so-called major hemisphere, usually the left. To that extent, McDougall was correct. The speechlessness of the right hemisphere has been seized upon by some as evidence that the consciousness of man can't be truly divided. But such an argument seems to me quite specious, rather like saying that a brain-damaged patient who simply can't speak, but can understand speech perfectly well, isn't conscious, and therefore isn't human. The minor right hemisphere isn't even totally illiterate. It can read. When the word comb is flashed on the left of a screen so that only the right hemisphere can see it, the patient can't say what was written, but can reach with his left hand and select the correct object from a choice. If a picture of a steaming cup of coffee is shown to the right hemisphere, the left hand can point out amongst an array of cards the one with the word hot written on it. So adjectives as well as nouns are understood by mind right. But all the time the left hemisphere, speaking through the mouth of the patient, has no idea what's going on. By all accounts, the right hemisphere isn't very good with verbs, but it does have the vocabulary and the syntactical ability of a young child. And what's more, in certain respects, the subordinate right excels over the dominant left. It's much better at any job that involves recognizing patterns and shapes, and particularly complicated solid objects. The right hemisphere can draw quite well with its left hand, but the left hemisphere even has problems in copying simple diagrams of houses and cubes. It's much more at home writing than drawing. Recognizing faces, surely an immensely important part of human social behaviour, is also apparently a speciality of the so-called minor hemisphere. Fascinating though these observations on split-brain people are, I believe they've been misinterpreted in their relevance to the functions of the normal human brain. Protagonists of different factions have all nurtured the idea that you and I have virtually independent sides to our brains, and therefore to our intellects. The dominant side, usually the left, talks, writes, does mathematics and thinks in a logical, serial way. The minor right side recognises shapes and faces, appreciates music, puts on its owner's clothes, and works in a global, intuitive fashion. The verbal, ordered culture of the Western world, dominated by scientific and technological progress, is, we're told, managed by the left hemispheres of its populations. The mystical, artistic and religious cultures of the East must be driven by their right hemispheres. There's a vocal movement that calls, presumably with its left hemisphere, for the liberation of its right. Some psychologists, most vociferously Robert Ornstein, want a revolution in Western education with more emphasis on non-verbal skills and the special attributes of the minor hemisphere, which are supposed to rule the cultures of the East. I can't help feeling that some Oriental Robert Ornstein, contemplating the material progress that those attributes of the left hemisphere have given to the Western world, might make just the opposite recommendation. In fact, Hugh Sykes-Davis, the scholar of English, recently attacked the rightist movement and complained that verbal skills are degenerating, not dominating, in our society. All this fiery rhetoric seems to me to be based on a curious assumption that the two hemispheres of a normal man are as divided as those of Sperry's patients. Under exceptional circumstances, in unusual people, the separate characteristics of the two halves of the brain might come into conflict. The author, J.M. Barrie, for instance, was ambidextrous. He even wrote his plays with either hand, and his desk is worn smooth on both sides to prove it. He was sure that his two hands had different characters, and he was inhabited by two different people. But in most of us, there's a constant traffic of information between the two hemispheres, a tying together of separate experiences, a sharing of special talents. What we should be striving to achieve for ourselves and our brains is not the pampering of one hemisphere to the neglect of the other, whether right or left, or their independent development, but the marriage and harmony of the two. It so happens that the special mental territories of the minor hemisphere, spatial perception, pictorial recognition, and intuitive thought, aren't easily amenable to conventional education. Nor is it clear that they would benefit from years of formal instruction. Systems of education, especially higher education, and this applies to every culture, seem designed to develop and exploit the powers of the hemisphere that's dominant for speech, for those powers depend most on factual knowledge and prolonged training. The ripening of cerebral dominance is one of the most important processes in the maturation of the brain. Unitary control of delicate motor skills like speech and the fine movements of the dominant hand requires the firm planting of the special apparatus for their control in one side of the brain. To ignore the special role and the particular educational needs of the dominant hemisphere, and to encourage the minor side to take charge, may produce deleterious consequences in behaviour. It could cause problems as profound as the disorders of emotion and speech, especially stuttering, that are attributed to another cultural interference with cerebral dominance, the forced use of the right hand in naturally left-handed children. This form of social brain control was common in Europe and the United States and was virtually mandatory in the Soviet Union until quite recently. The debate about liberating the minor hemisphere is only a fashionable twist to an ancient and inextinguishable aspiration of man to control his brain, or more often to control someone else's. The brain is the organ of behaviour, and the dream of every leader, whether a tyrannical despot or a benign prophet, is to regulate the behaviour of his people. There's a growing fear that a considerable fraction of brain research is aimed at making such control a reality. It's true that animals will work ceaselessly to receive electrical stimulation through electrodes implanted in so-called pleasure centres in their brains. The most effective areas lie in the hypothalamus, which is involved in the regulation of motivated behaviour, like eating, drinking and sex, and in the nearby limbic system, which is thought to control emotions like rage, fear and joy. It's also true that electrical stimulation at certain sites or local damage at others can calm the fiercest beast or turn a placid animal into a savage killer. The physiologist J.F. Fulton wrote that a certain tiny injury to a monkey's brain yields an animal that is formidably ferocious. I finally had to decree that no one should ever examine such a monkey alone, for they attack to kill, and they single out the examiner's neck as their initial objective. There is, naturally, widespread apprehension, nurtured by popular publications and not always discouraged by over-enthusiastic experimenters, that such techniques will soon be part and parcel of everyday life. Such fears are, in the main, quite unfounded. Fortunately, the sheer paraphernalia of experimental brain manipulation, the implanted electrodes, the cables and electronics, the tedious surgical techniques, make that kind of brain control beyond the reach of any modern-day Alexander or Genghis Khan who wishes to motivate an army or subjugate the world at the push of a button. And in any case, are our brains not already more totally disciplined, our opinions more firmly moulded, and our minds more sharply directed by the political and social environment than by any electrode that could be put in our heads? The stentorian voices of the mass media are more universally powerful than the indiscriminate persuasions of any mind-altering drug. More illuminating than pointing an accusing finger at the motives of brain research is to ask why society always has attempted to regulate and order the behaviour of its members. The answer might lie in a very basic biological need to identify, in order to identify with. Group selection is a term used to describe the operation of evolutionary forces on closely knit and interbreeding groups of animals, not just individuals. It was recognised by Charles Darwin as an important factor in the emergence of social behaviour. By forming collaborative groups, largely based on family ties, animals can improve their chances of surviving as a group, and hence of propagating their common genes. Biologists even seek to explain the most cherished of human ethical principles altruism, heroism, and unselfishness in terms of group selection of shared genetic material. J.B.S. Haldane once remarked that he was willing to lay down his life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. Now, the preservation of common genes amongst a social group by such acts of cooperation and self-sacrifice would be greatly enhanced by an ability of the individual to recognise in others those similarities in appearance and behaviour that betray shared genes. One of the major factors in the evolution of human society is the specialisation of the brain to recognise and classify. That power may have had its origin in the discrimination of genetic similarities and dissimilarities in other men. An animal, like man, that could actively direct its altruism and shape its behavioural ethics to protect its own genetically similar colleagues would have had an enormous advantage in group selection. The roots of social discrimination today, then, lie in the group discrimination of yesterday. The intolerance of difference has produced such social cancers as apartheid in South Africa, the caste structure of India, and the endless warfare of Europe. Many of the most precious elements in human social behaviour, such as formalised sexual bonding and family structure, rich communal ceremony, and the embracing of ethical principles within religious codes, can be viewed as deliberate cultural exaggerations of inherited components of behaviour that favour group selection. The desire to regulate behaviour, even to bring deviance back to the norm, may be a further cultural embellishment of the logic of group selection. Nowhere is this more evident than in the field of mental disease, where the questions of social intolerance of difference and the danger of active brain control become most profound. The problem of illness of the mind is a challenge not only to medicine, but also to society. Each year, 1 man in 14, 1 woman in 7 consult a doctor about some form of mental disease. Every year, 600,000 people in Great Britain are referred to psychiatrists. Because the very symptoms of mental disease are defined as aberrations of behaviour, they bring the sufferer into conflict with the community in a way that no illness of any other organ can. Diseases of the mind are an insult to the behavioural order on which society rests. Most of all, they are usually disorders of emotion, a function that the human mind has so carefully concealed under its cognitive skin. It's no coincidence that in history the same treatments have been meted out to the mentally sick as to those other offenders against the order of society, the criminal and the heretic. At best they've had their demons cast out or merely been imprisoned. At worst they've been tortured to death. Textbooks of psychiatry try to achieve the same as the codes of secular law or religious commandments. They all attempt to establish definitions and boundaries for normal behaviour. But just as the law adjusts to the nature of crime, just as heretics alter the religion that they offend, so cultural evolution has benefited from certain extremes of behaviour. Visionaries like Joan of Arc and William Blake, artists like Van Gogh and Edvard Munch, were, by conventional definition, mentally disturbed. The paradox of cultural evolution is that as it gains from the contribution of those people who deviate significantly from the norm in intelligence or inventiveness, in artistry or in insight, it also builds up resistance to change and distrust of extremes by its emphasis on group identity. The more revolutionary schools of psychiatry, for example that of R.D. Laing, argue that the definition of sickness of the mind is a product of a fault in society itself. The anthropological extension of this viewpoint maintains that since mental illness is culturally relative, those whom we call mad might be able to function usefully in societies that we call primitive. The delusions and hallucinations of the schizophrenic might be admired, and the mentally ill could fill important roles such as shaman or witch doctor. But recent careful studies of Alaskan Eskimos and the Yoruba of rural Nigeria have cast doubt on the opinion that the illness of mental disturbance is merely and entirely a label that is tied on socially unacceptable behaviour. Both of these peoples have special names for mental illness: Nutkavihak for the Eskimo, Were for the Yoruba, and neither ethnic group applies those terms to their shamans and healers. The shaman in a trance is described by an Eskimo as out of his mind, but not crazy. There's little respect for those who are thought to be genuinely mad. They're shackled or sedated by the Yoruba healer. They're tied to posts or locked in barred igloos by the Eskimos. But if mental illness isn't a unique product of our way of life, its definition has been stretched to make use of the special powers that society has assumed for dealing with those that it defines as different. In their book, A Question of Madness, Jores and Roy Medvedev give a moving and bitter account of the enforced incarceration of Jores Medvedev, the eminent Russian biochemist, in a mental hospital, because of his stubborn opposition to local party bureaucrats and his public pronouncements against the Soviet state. Under the frighteningly broad definition of creeping schizophrenia that's employed by orthodox Russian psychiatry, Medvedev was declared to be suffering from paranoia because he showed poor adaptation to the social environment. Medvedev himself was relatively fortunate. He spent only 19 days in that political asylum before the torrent of protest organised by his brother led to his release. But others aren't so lucky, and the abuse of psychiatric definition continues. Although we're right to be indignant about this flagrant affront to personal liberty in the USSR, we shouldn't believe that our own approach to mental disease is without fault. A lack of sound theoretical knowledge makes even adequate diagnosis unlikely. In a recent survey, 200 children who'd been diagnosed as autistic were subjected to a second opinion. Only 33 were diagnosed as autistic by the second examiner. 53 were said to be childhood schizophrenics, 51 retarded, 7 deaf, and so on. Just as the criteria for diagnosis aren't rigid, so the methods of treatment are largely empirical. The use of surgical damage to the brain in the treatment of the mentally ill is certainly the closest that we come to the horror of socially applied control of the brain, and it illustrates both the inadequate restraints on the treatment of the mentally sick and the poor theoretical basis for that therapy. In some cases, like the use of the split brain technique for the treatment of epilepsy, the methods and consequences had been carefully worked out beforehand with experimental animals. But psychosurgery, the treatment of emotional disorders by operations on apparently healthy brain tissue, proceeds with a lack of experimental background that would be considered inadequate in all other areas of medicine. The whole of psychosurgery had its origins in a research report delivered by C. Jacobson and J. F. Fulton at a conference of neurologists in London in 1935. They'd been training 2 chimpanzees to remember where a morsel of food was hidden. One of them, called Becky, was particularly temperamental and became extremely distressed when she failed at this task. She would fly into a tantrum and refuse to perform when the food was hidden from view. Fulton and Jacobson performed surgical removal of part of the frontal lobes of the cerebral hemispheres, and they reported that Becky no longer became disturbed during the experimental task. A Portuguese neuropsychiatrist, Egas Moniz, rose after the talk and asked, "If frontal lobe removal prevents the development of experimental neuroses in animals and eliminates frustration behaviour, why would it not be feasible to relieve anxiety states in man by surgical means?" Within the year, Moniz and the surgeon Almeida Lima had started to perform operations on the frontal lobes of deranged patients, and by 1950, some 20,000 people around the world, including prisoners and children, had been treated this way. And all of this stemmed from an almost anecdotal observation on a single, nervous chimpanzee. Worst of all, the effectiveness of these operations was evaluated by the very surgeons who'd invested their careers in psychosurgery. Failure wasn't easy to accept. And with any treatment for the mentally ill, it's difficult to establish with certainty the success of the technique itself because of the fairly high rate of spontaneous remission from symptoms and the undoubted value of the extra attention that special patients receive, whatever their treatment. However, it became clear that the benefits of gross psychosurgical methods were often minimal, and sometimes the consequences were disastrous. Moniz himself, who won the Nobel Prize in 1949, was shot in the spine by one of his own lobotomized patients. But once established, psychosurgery became self-sustaining. It's still widely practiced. The techniques are more sophisticated and the surgical lesions much more discreet, but the lack of moral restraint and theoretical background is just as serious. Significantly, some of the strongest criticism of psychosurgery comes from the behavioural scientists, whose experiments are quoted as justification for the surgical methods. Destruction of the amygdala, a part of the limbic system, is used as a treatment for extreme aggression, although in animals, damage to the amygdala sometimes increases aggressive behaviour. Aggressive patients have also been subjected to lesions of part of the hypothalamus, dangerously close to regions involved in the regulation of eating and drinking. The rationale behind this procedure is that a similar operation in cats can abolish the ferocious behaviour that results from an earlier injury to another limbic structure, the septum. But the septum isn't even a clearly defined area in the human brain. Other parts of the hypothalamus are destroyed as treatments for obesity and even a symptom called latent homosexuality. That other widely used technique, electroconvulsive therapy, which undoubtedly has brought relief to many of the mentally ill, is nevertheless based on even more obtuse and spurious theoretical justification. The present-day use of convulsive therapy stems from a revival of the 18th century opinion that maniacs were best treated by a very severe physical stress, and from the entirely erroneous view that epileptics are protected from schizophrenia by their natural convulsions. Of course, medicine must work empirically until it has sound theoretical grounds for action. Sick people need to be treated. But in most fields of medicine, empirical art has been rationalised, modified or supplemented through experimentally derived knowledge of how the body works. New methods of treatment have grown out of careful and thorough experimental work. In the management of many diseases of the brain, this is not yet the case. To that extent, some aspects of neurology and psychiatry are like medieval alchemy practiced with 20th century tools. It's true that the growing use of drugs in psychotherapy, which is also not without its critics, has dramatically reduced the number of long-term admissions to mental institutions. But far more important, the intensive research on the action of therapeutic drugs, much of it demanded by law before they can be used, begins to offer hope of an explanation of the biochemical basis, at least of schizophrenia. There is, then, the promise that research on the brain will provide a genuine rationale for the treatment of mental disease. But much more than that, it will give a greater understanding of the nature of man himself. The study of the brain is one of the last frontiers of human knowledge, and of much more immediate importance than understanding the infinity of space or the mystery of the atom. For without a description of the brain, without an account of the forces that mould human behaviour, there can never be a truly objective new ethic based on the needs and rights of man. We need that new ethic if we're to overcome the intolerance of difference which has entrenched society in dogma and discrimination, to dispel the naturalistic fallacy of arguing that the way we do behave is the way we must and ought to behave. I began my first lecture with talk of revolution, and I end this final one on the same note. Revolution, social as well as scientific, grows out of knowledge. Only when the choices for action are transparent can proper choice be made. In the words of Mao Zedong, we can learn what we did not know. We are not only good at destroying the old world, we are also good at building the new. I've described the brain as an organ, as a part of the body no more magical than the heart and the liver, which were themselves once thought to do the job of the brain. But also I've tried to show that the actions of the brain are quite unlike those of any other organ, because they determine the behaviour of one man towards his fellows. The brain, struggling to understand the brain, is society trying to explain itself.